most of the conflicts are in Muslim majority countries or are affecting Muslims. So we can assume that this is going to be huge numbers of Muslim vulnerable populations. So I'm really excited to invite the panel. We have some amazing speakers today. The first, we will start with Yassmin. Yassmin is from George Washington University. She is a PhD in counseling. Her research interests includes mental health within first and second generation immigrants. Her clinical experiences includes working at a substance abuse and eating disorder treatment center, and she also works with domestic violence victims. And Yassmin, with that, I'll pass it on to you.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I know that I think Leila's name wasn't included in at first, so I'm going to also let her introduce herself before we get started.
Yeah, for sure. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Leila. I'm excited to be here, to be in this conversation. Yassmin and I are going to talk specifically a little bit about kind of a culturally responsive model when working with Muslim refugee families. But just briefly, a little bit about myself. I am a doctoral candidate here at William & Mary, where I'm getting my PhD in counselor education and supervision. And so refugee mental health, immigrant mental health, and Muslim mental health are part of my research interests as well. And I am currently working also as the student director of the New Horizons Family Counseling Center here, which basically provides free family counseling services to families in this Hampton Roads area in Virginia. And so we're looking forward to a good discussion. So very briefly, we just wanted to, I'm sure for a lot of us, we understand and, understand the severity of the refugee mental health crisis as well. And so really our presentation today is a little more specifically focused on families that have resettled in the US and the kinds of culturally competent therapeutic services that we can provide as practitioners. And so we're really just looking more specific to the US, but that doesn't mean that what we're going to talk today can't be applied to the general refugee families in the world. And we really wanted to focus on families because the large portion of the refugee population is children. And so it's really important, we feel like, when we're taking kind of a systemic approach and we're thinking about long-lasting change, that a family modality of therapy can be really beneficial and helpful for any kind of family configuration. So single parent household, grandparents, whatever it may be, but taking a more holistic view in that manner.
So I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about Muslim refugees. So they found that in 2016 we had the highest, the historic high of Muslim refugees in the United States. It was the first time that we surpassed, that Muslims surpassed Christians in the amount of refugees coming in. However, that drastically declined in the following years after the Trump administration and the travel restrictions. In contrast, so currently, well, in 2019, there was about 20%, that was supposed to say 20% of the refugees being from Muslim countries. But in contrast, in the rest of the world, about 2/3 of refugees living outside of their birth country have been Muslim. So one thing to remember specifically about Muslim refugees is that on top of them experiencing the same microaggressions, acculturation difficulties as other Muslim immigrants, they also experience the same pre and post resettlement trauma and sort of specific issues that refugees experience.
Yeah, so speaking of trauma, which I'm sure we could have its own presentation just on trauma or even more so, but very briefly, it's really important as practitioners to be thinking about how trauma, especially with refugee families, is going to be compounded and multiple traumatic events. And so this is going to be really important when we think about our work in the family system, about how we're going to be able to approach this kind of trauma. So trauma is happening, prior to flight, in processing, and I think sometimes often we forget, but also upon arrival. So when families are once here and resettled, the difficulties that they have in navigating. And so so it's really important when we think about our theoretical lens that we're making sure that it is trauma informed as well as culturally competent.
So a few facts about trauma and adjustment in general. So basically, most refugees are victims of multiple traumatic events. So there's going to be several that includes things such as torture, killings, incarceration, starvation, rape, and physical beating, sexual assault. But it's also important to remember the trauma of also having to be displaced and moving to a completely different foreign country. And one thing to remember when you think of trauma in general, the first few, it's important to act immediately after a trauma. So the first few years after resettlement is very critical. This really sets the stage for how these individuals use coping skills and how they cope later on. So learning new coping skills and communication patterns, basically figuring out how to meet their basic needs. That's very important early on in order to predict the best outcome of healing and coping. It's also important to look at the differences between children and adults in this situation. Children do learn the language of resettlement faster than their parents. This could be due to several factors, such as being immersed in a school system, being exposed to media, just developmentally being able to take in more of their surroundings and adapt. And this can lead to issues if you're a family counselor, if you work with families, such as family dysfunction, conflict, differences in values, such as dating, marriage, curfews. So the way children and the way adults cope with resettlement is very different.
Definitely. And so keeping that in mind, basically the proposed model that we want to talk about is an already developed model, but we want to adapt it for specifically work with Muslim refugee families. So the model that we're looking towards is the culturally sensitive model by BMAC and Chung, who are now retired counselor educators at George Mason. And basically their model was focusing on these multiple phases that the clinician or the practitioner is considering when they are working with the individual. But we've adapted it to consider it also for family counseling as well too, and how we can incorporate elements that might be helpful for especially Muslim refugee families. And so the phases are kind of just happen simultaneously, and it's up to the clinician to ensure that they're being mindful of all the different components in order to provide trauma-informed but also culturally responsive care as well too. So looking at the different phases, the first phase is really about mental health education. And I would say that what we're really talking about here is psychoeducation. So we're thinking about counseling maybe in a Western context for a lot of refugees. Maybe there's not context behind that or understanding behind that. So as a clinician feeling like it's important to help the families understand what to expect from counseling, what counseling may look like, and really focusing on that psychoeducational component. And I would say that this comes along with just being able to build trust and safety in a relationship, which is incredibly important, especially considering the kinds of events that may have happened before. So things like confidentiality, barriers, self-disclosure, roles and expectations are all the kinds of things that the clinician wants to walk through and explain to the family, and also explain at a developmentally appropriate level that children and adults can understand as well too. And I also feel like along with this, you can do a good job, especially in family counseling, if you think from a structural perspective, this can do a good job of modeling for the parents the kinds of ways that you might set expectations in the family or roles in the families and stuff too. The clinician could do a good job with just the tool of counseling to be able to explain that, or the counseling room to be able to explain that. The second phase is kind of what we would mostly think, so conventional therapy basically. And in this case, we wanted to focus specifically on family therapy while totally recognizing and understanding that some particular individuals or particular family members may need individual work or may need group work depending on their experiences in the past. But especially with family counseling, we kind of want to focus on 3 areas. So cross-cultural skills, so this is going to be just your basic open listening skills, picking up on nonverbal, verbal cues, but also maybe focusing on healing methodology. So I'm thinking about, for families, having a shared narrative is going to be incredibly important. So incorporating aspects of narrative therapy can be really helpful. And you can even include elements of the Quran and Sunnah to be able to draw parallels to stories about difficulties and hardships that can be really helpful for the family to be able to kind of make sense of what has happened. But additionally, along with that narrative approach, you're also going to be having some cognitive behavioral types of approaches that really focus on day-to-day adjustment concerns and issues that are also arising in the family as well too. The second piece about this is you really want to be mindful of the socio-political climate. This is something that all of us are aware of, but especially particularly now, we want to be mindful of how xenophobia, racism, Islamophobia are all impacting our clients and our families. It's up to us to not only be up to date about it, but also thinking about how those look different for different people. So for kids in school, that's going to look really different from adults who are working or parents who are working. So I think it's really our responsibility to make sure that we're up to date on that. And the third piece about this phase is the collectivist culturally responsive therapeutic intervention. So really being mindful of, rather than honing individual each person, but taking a bigger type of perspective. We know community can be really important and a big part of healing when it comes to this kind of work, and especially in the Muslim community, and the Ummah can be like a really powerful tool, or feeling connected to the people around you. And so as a clinician, understanding that my work in the room might be important, but also I want to make sure that I connect services and connect support, whether that's with the mosque or however so it may be. So kind of thinking from that broader community lens as well. When it comes to cultural empowerment, it's really just about helping the client or empowering the client to be able to advocate for their own needs. And so what this might look like is that sometimes in helping families, we need to be able to help them just navigate their practical problems in the moment, rather than some of these more deeper psychological needs. So of course, I am trauma informed and I understand how those things affect the families and the kinds of considerations. But maybe in this moment right now, the only thing that needs to be focused in are the types of practical issues. So whether that's around education, housing, employment, that's where my focus is going to be. And I really, as a family clinician, want to work with the parents or through the parents. It can be really easy for the kids to get involved in some of these more adult decisions, or some of these things that are more for adults, but I really want to empower the parents to be able to make these decisions and understandings, especially since kids might be picking things up faster or acculturating faster, but at the same time, I want to make sure I drop boundaries to make sure that they're doing what they need to do, which is to be kids, rather than having to take some of these adult roles as well too.
Okay, and for phase 4 would be called Indigenous Healing. And basically, the World Health Organization found in 2003 that combining Western and Indigenous healing methodologies resulted in the best therapeutic outcomes for refugees. So, and this is something to keep in mind, because a lot of Western practitioners do tend to maybe disregard some aspects of Indigenous healing. And the model basically highlights using or incorporating Indigenous healers and considering them legitimate in the treatment of while working with your client. So this could include things such as imams, or if you were working with a client, basically different types of healing. There's an example that the model gives that included a Sudanese widow who was working with, who the practitioner ended up using an imam to help her recite prayers in combination with her therapy once a week. So including that aspect is important to also help the client feel that their culture is being taken into account, and that they feel comfortable, and basically their spiritual aspect is also being taken seriously. And then the 5th phase is social justice and human rights, and most refugees have experienced some sort of human rights violation, which includes like imprisonment, rape, sexual assault. And so when it comes to social justice and human rights advocacy, as therapists, we need to tap into the fact that this is part of our this is an ethical requirement for most of our fields, and that includes helping them find or helping them gain access to health, housing, employment, and things like that. So a few examples of things that we can do of social justice work that we can do in phase 5 includes like educating clients about their rights, assisting clients and their families and their communities to speak up and stand out and stand up for equal treatment, changing policy by advocating, writing to legislators, speaking at public hearings, educating colleagues and other helping professionals, and just doing, I guess, a little bit of social work, helping them get resources, things like that. So social justice and human rights advocacy is also going to be a big part of your work in this model.
Definitely. And all these elements, phases would be working simultaneously, and you as the counselor will make sure that you're attending. So normally we would just be thinking of phase 2 as what we do, but the model kind of helps you think more of a holistic perspective that might be helpful. So very briefly, just some more particularly like practical suggestions for family counselors to keep in mind when they are working with refugee Muslim families is obviously you want to make sure communication is clear and important. So if you need bilingual translators, you want to make sure that you're getting culturally responsive ones, that you're making sure that they are aware about confidentiality and their role in the process, because it's really important to make sure that you're able to communicate. So even if there may be children in the family who understand or are better, their language skills may be easier or more adaptive, I want to make sure that I'm working with the parents more rather than with the children, because I don't want to create some of that role confusion. So sometimes it's important to be tapped into that and make sure that I'm doing everything on my end to ensure that I'm able to provide that support. Additionally, as a clinician, I know that my role isn't just in the room, in the therapy room, it's outside. There are a lot of things happening and I want to help coordinate care. So if I've explained to the family and talked to the family, maybe signing releases might be helpful to be able to coordinate with other individuals. Sometimes a lot of different people are doing a lot of different services in their own little bubbles and we're not necessarily working together. That can be the most helpful for the family, especially when you have multiple family members, you might be connected to a bunch of different areas depending on what may be going on. I think a big key aspect for families is really empowering parents to feel included and supported in their child's education and transition. And so this might mean that I work with the school counselor at the school to be able to help advocate for the family's needs. I maybe empower them to feel like that the space that they have a right to know about their child's education and understand and be able to communicate with teachers, rather than just feel like that that's not their space. And so there's definitely a role as a family counselor that I can play in that as well too, and also helps empower the parents as well to be able to feel and take ownership for their children's education and their children's decisions. The other thing that's really important, I would say, is really just like inclusive spaces. So what does your space look like when you are practicing as a clinician? Does it inviting? Does it really help people feel like that they're safe here, that is a comfortable space for them? So some of our own just kind of pausing and looking at that as well too. Is it providing an inclusive space for everybody, and will families feel comfortable feeling like this is a space for them? And then really just like a holistic view that is not just focusing on deep complex trauma, but also focusing on just like immediate acculturation concerns that might be more about practicality, and understanding that our role isn't just limited to the 15 minutes counseling session, but also beyond what can we do to help families as well too.
And I'll just briefly go over some aspects that have already been mentioned, but when working with Muslim refugees, things to keep in mind includes basically utilizing religious resources, not shying away from using what the client believes in, and like the Quran and the Hadith to help them cope. And one important facet is also to not assume that you understand all aspects of the culture, and watching for that transference that can arise when you're working with a client. Remembering there are differences. Everybody's experience is very unique and very different, and especially if you are there are differences between immigrants, refugees, how basically that acculturation difference presents itself as well. In understanding cultural differences in communication and time, issues that may arise basically when you're working with a client. Again, working with religious leaders, helping clients identify safe religious spaces, whether that's helping them develop a community, a network, finding that social system that helps them with their coping process as well.
We really appreciate you guys listening in. We're looking forward to what questions may be. And of course, if you need any references or need the slides or you want any conversation with us, our contact is here as well too. So Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallah khair, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much for an amazing presentation. There are so many points and important tools that I would be utilizing as well. So thank you for that. So we go next to Diana. And Diana has been a good friend of the conference for a long time. And it's a personal pleasure to introduce her. She's a global mental health research consultant and a recent Fulbright research fellow. Her research interests are in refugee trauma and faith-sensitive approaches to mental health. She has coordinated humanitarian research for UN agencies, NGOs across the Middle East and Europe. Her work has been published in Lancet and BMG and PLOS Medicine. Diana is a graduate of Johns Hopkins, Bloomberg School of Public Health, and Arizona State University. And as always, we are very glad to welcome you to the Muslim Mental Health Conference, Diana.
Thank you, Dr. Farha, and thank you so much for the generous introduction. I'm attempting to share my screen here. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Again, sorry for the technical difficulty. My name is Diana Reyes. I'm a public health researcher working currently for the World Health Organization as well as University of California, Berkeley. It's such a privilege to be here, although I wish I could meet you all in person. But thank you so much to Dr. Farha and the Muslim Mental Health Conference team for putting together such a great virtual conference so far. I'm really lucky to be here alongside my panelists as well. So without further ado, I had the privilege last year of being a Fulbright Research Fellow in Germany through the US Fulbright program, where I worked with Charité University of Medicine on a project related to faith-based coping of Arabic-speaking refugees in Berlin. This was part of a larger study called the Muslim Mental Health and Refugees and Asylum Seekers Study hosted by the Charité University of Medicine. And I conducted the sub-study as a qualitative study looking at the specific issue. So looking forward to sharing some results and to answering questions towards the end. To give you a little bit of background on why this issue is important to me, but also why it's pertinent on a global scale, especially based on what Dr. Farha mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. We've seen a large flood of refugees displaced around the world, and Germany has been one of the countries in the last few years that's welcomed the majority of the share of refugees and asylum seekers that are fleeing countries and conflicts like Syria and Afghanistan, as well as Iraq. At the peak of what's deemed the displacement crisis in 2015, Germany welcomed nearly 1 million refugees from these countries, as well as others. And you can see here from this table here, this map, that in 2015, over 1.1 million refugees were welcomed to Germany in 2015 alone. So they've really taken on a large amount of the refugee population, which makes the issue of integrating refugees as well as maintaining mental health and well-being of refugees particularly pertinent. And so the research has shown that there are high prevalence rates of mental health disorders among refugees who settled in Germany. And this is not only because of the conditions that refugees are facing and integrating into the German context, but also the conditions that they face back home when they witnessed conflict or they were escaping poverty, as well as the treacherous journeys that they endured on their way to Europe to seek asylum. And among these members of people who have fled their countries are members of my own family who fled Syria in 2015 and arrived to Germany. And I was able last year to see them, how they were coping with the change and how they were integrating. And it was very present and available. You could tell that they were very having trouble keeping motivated, having trouble learning a new language and enduring this new culture shock of being in a new society. So this is what motivated some of the work that I was doing and looking at the broader picture of integration and how mental health plays a huge role in that. I wanted to give some context also on how the sharp rise in numbers of Muslims in Germany has really changed the socio-political landscape in Germany and in Europe more broadly. So as my colleagues mentioned in the previous presentation, we're seeing rises in discrimination globally of refugees and migrants, particularly those coming from Muslim majority countries. And this really useful study by the Pew Research Center from 2017 looks at and predicts the growth of Europe's Muslim population in the next couple of years, with or without migration. So I highly suggest you look at this, because this means that this issue will be a long term issue that we need to consider as clinicians, as public health professionals, and people invested in global mental health of refugees. And so I had come across some literature about the importance of faith-based coping, or how individuals use their religious or spiritual beliefs to help them interpret traumatic events that had happened to them, and how to essentially overcome any personal issues or mental health conditions that were emerging. And so I kind of shaped this study within the broader context in Germany, which was looking at Muslims in Germany and people coming from Muslim majority countries, and arriving to this, especially cities that are very secularized and don't really incorporate aspects of faith into mental health care and treatment. So the aims of my study were to explore and understand spiritual and religious forms of coping, which I used the umbrella term of faith-based coping of mental illness among Arabic-speaking refugee populations. And what I did was I conducted semi-structured qualitative interviews to explore these issues, as well as look at how these faith-based coping strategies can be optimized from a mental health service delivery and integration perspective. I wanted to break the text up here a little bit, sharing a photo of the recruitment process that some of my colleagues and I in Germany did, so that we could have participants join the study. And this is us hanging up recruitment brochures in what's called Arab Street in Berlin. This is outside of a shawarma shop. So we would go inside and we would tell the shop owners, hey, can we hang up a recruitment brochure for a study which is supporting mental health for refugees? And people were really open to it, and it was really exciting to have conversations about the work we were doing. And so my study was done within the context of this broader umbrella randomized controlled trial, which was looking at the mental health of refugees and asylum seekers broadly. And this was led by the Charité University of Medicine in Berlin. And they were also looking not only at Arabic-speaking populations, but Farsi-speaking populations as well, the majority coming from Afghanistan. But my specific study sample included those from Arabic-speaking countries, including refugees and asylum-seeking adults from Iraq and Syria. And what we did was we screened individuals who were coming to the mental health clinic using the PHQ-9 and the refugee health screener, so that they had some sort of, they demonstrated depressive or anxiety symptoms, as well as symptoms of trauma. And then my research questions focused on how they coped using spiritual or religious aspects of well-being, and how this impacted their overall integration into German society. And so just to give you an overview of the methods, I conducted interviews with 17 participants, 11 were male and 6 were female. All of these interviews took place at the private mental health clinic, and I conducted the interviews myself. And all participants happened to identify as Muslims, 2 identified as Muslims but non-practicing. And we also accounted for, in addition to other demographics, reasons for migration, including why people had fled their countries, and most had said that they were fleeing war and conflict. So this was important to consider within the broader findings. In terms of my analysis, I translated all interviews from English to Arabic and analyzed using qualitative software using a grounded theory approach in order to contextualize some of these findings within the person's life story. The results were structured into 6 themes, and for the reasons of this presentation, in order to keep things short, I'm going to focus on the most 2 pertinent themes, which were faith-based coping methods, as well as advice to mental health providers that the interviewees had in terms of cultural and spiritual specific coping. So one of the main findings was that most participants endorsed their faith as a positive source of comfort and reassurance. This was noted among 15 of the 17 participants. And this included examples like attending religious services, making supplications, meeting other Muslims in Germany, as well as other refugee populations and communities, as well as seeking help from a religious leader. And participants expressed their preference for Arabic-speaking mental health professionals, although they didn't have to be Muslim, but in order to be able to share some of the context of which they had endured, and people who, in order to be able to seek treatment from somebody who had understood kind of what the context in which they were coming from. So although I don't have time to go through each of these quotes, I think I highlighted some of the most powerful themes in order to make this relevant for clinical practice. So some of the participants had mentioned how important it was to think and remember God. So this really stood out to me as something that people utilize even when they were walking, or especially when they were alone, or when they were feeling isolated from their family, those who were back home, that they would just remember God and remember that He had placed them in this context for a specific reason, as well as noting certain existential themes like this world is temporary and He's testing me, or making me testing my faith and see if I would be able to cope and overcome these things. So this was something that really stood out to me in terms of coping with mental health conditions. And then others who said that they felt very anxious or depressed would either read or hear somebody reciting Quran, as well as pray or supplicate in order to help calm their nerves. And this was also done when they were alone, which was very interesting. Two of the participants shared how their faith-based coping methods, such as thinking of God or praying and supplicating, should be supplemented with medical treatment. And I think that was reflective of all the participants, because all of them were coming to a mental health service facility seeking treatment at a point where other methods hadn't worked out for them. And so I thought this was a really interesting point, especially given some of the stigma that individuals from Arabic or Muslim majority countries experience, but individuals who I interviewed said that that not only should they be praying at home and using faith-based coping methods, but they should have some sort of medical treatment supplementing them. And other people noted that in Berlin there was a lack of mosques nearby, mainly because they were living in remote areas outside of the city center, or there were mosques that were not Arabic speaking, or they were mainly Turkish or other types of affiliations. And so individuals said that if there was a mosque nearby, they would find this as a very useful form of support and something that they could rely on, especially for seeking religious help from a cleric, or having some sort of sense of community. And on that note, some people had sought help from a religious cleric. Some people, before seeking mental health services in the clinic, had asked for help from a sheikh in a nearby mosque, or somebody they had back home. And those individuals gave them advice, but some of the participants I interviewed questioned some of the effectiveness of the advice that the sheikhs had given them, especially now that they were getting medical treatment. And then lastly, on the theme that I highlighted regarding what participants expected from non-Arab or German mental health providers, individuals have thought that if those providers knew a little bit more about their cultural or spiritual backgrounds, as well as the socio-political circumstances that they escaped from, that they would find it much easier to interact with mental health professionals who were non-Arab or non-Muslim, but that German mental health providers, for example, would be able to provide better mental health care if they understood things like Arab culture and the significance of family and collective support. So that was a quick summary of some of the results we came across. Hopefully the paper will be published sometime this fall, and it will include more comprehensive recommendations and analysis of the results. And but broadly, I think the perspectives that were shared by participants I interviewed demonstrated how dependent they were on certain aspects of their faith, especially in supporting them through these difficult circumstances. And a lot of them had, there were different colors of experience. So people were struggling with their faith upon arrival. Some people, especially some of the males, were feeling a little bit distrustful of some of the religious institutions in Germany and trying to seek help from a cleric was not an option for them. So that was something else I noted, was these differences in perspectives shared by males and females, and especially uses of individual faith-based coping mechanisms among females, such as praying at home and supplicating and seeking help from a cleric back home. And the findings of these study really demonstrate the importance of considering faith and alternative forms of coping when addressing refugee mental health. And this can provide alternatives to some of the barriers posed by the German health system, including cultural and linguistic barriers, but also barriers that we can apply to other Western contexts that are hosting a large share of refugees from Muslim majority countries. And although I'm not a clinician, I thought I would share some of the implications for practice that I thought would be useful. I think most of you and individuals who are invested in providing mental health care to Muslim populations can understand that these findings really demonstrate how mental health service provision should be optimized and can be optimized to address gaps in culturally sensitive healthcare, especially in a place like Germany. And these themes can really be translated into strategies to improve mental health interventions and accounting for faith-based coping mechanisms such as the ones I shared with you. And some of my interest as a public health professional is how can these lessons be applied into broader integration policies, such as expanding mental health services for refugee populations, and how can we accommodate for cultural, economic, and spiritual needs. And I am hoping to share these research results not only in a journal, but also for mental health professionals, NGOs, and humanitarian aid agencies that can continue to provide mental health care to populations from Muslim majority countries, especially those in Germany who might not be able to have to access mental health services or be able to find Arabic speaking or individuals, mental health providers who understand the context in which they're coming from. So thank you very much for your time. I'm happy to answer any questions in the panel, and I really appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana. I had got a chance to go and work with refugees in Freiburg, Germany. And I was so concerned and shocked to see, you know, as you mentioned, that the German culture is very, I don't know if you guys can hear me still.
I can hear you.
Yeah, the German culture is so very of the, including religion in any of their policies. And I had to do so many presentations at different levels to kind of stress the very point that you are making, that for these communities, these faith-based minorities that are coming in as refugees, not to include religion is kind of actually a disservice. It's just adding to their stress. And we had to do so many first aid mental health trainings for imams there. So it was a very, I can understand the hard work it must be to do this in Germany. It was really difficult for me. But thank you for a wonderful presentation. Moving on, I'm gonna introduce Hadia. Okay, Hadia, are you ready? Hadia Zarzour is a licensed clinical professional counselor who came to the US in 2009 on a Fulbright scholarship to pursue her master's in community counseling at Loyola University. She's certified in global refugee trauma from Harvard University. And I think there are just a handful of people certified in that program, the last I checked. So it's a big achievement. And she's currently in a private practice. Hadia co-founded Insan, an international nonprofit organization dedicated to providing psychological support to Syrian refugees. She's a co-founder of Syrian Community Network, a nonprofit organization that focuses on supporting the Syrian refugees. And Hadia, it's always a pleasure to welcome you to Muslim Mental Health Conference. We kind of rely on you presenting. So I'm so glad that you are here again and are able to present.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abbasi. It's my honor, absolute honor, and the same, place and panel. So I really appreciate all what you've been doing. I'm really honored. Thank you for all your efforts. And actually, today I feel this project is really very special to my heart because it connects my two worlds. I actually was an educator back in Syria. So half of my career, like 10 years, I spent in teaching in school settings and universities. And then I came to the US and I became a clinician. So here with this intervention, Strong, I connect the two worlds. It's really having kind of like group therapy kind of a thing. I'll tell you more about it in a second, in school settings. So I think it's very important when we have both fields kind of like intersect and support each other. So today, actually, I'm presenting on behalf of the main developer of this intervention, Dr. Sharon Hoover. She is on the faculty of the Division of Child Psychiatry at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, and she's also the co-director of National Center for School Mental Health, where this work or this intervention really originated. I'm very grateful to be part of this developing and training team for Strong, and actually it's been all started in Ontario 4 years ago, and we piloted the project 2 years ago. The exciting news is that actually Strong was launched back in October in 2019 into the United States. We started in New York and then Chicago and then Boston. Okay, so the focus of school mental health center is advancing policy and practice and research and training in the area of mental health and education. And that intersection, the school mental health has been around since 1995. And some of the work we've done has focused on how we can better support newcomer youth in our school setting. And in general, we're always thinking, as I said, about this intersection and how can we work together between communities and school, and how can we bring more community behavioral health providers into the school setting so we keep the support for our youth and children. So Strong really is a kind of this intervention that reflects. So when we're implementing it, we're teaching or we're training mental health providers from communities, from agencies, and also mental health providers in a school setting. I do want to acknowledge our funders and collaborators. As I said, the work that this work was initiated a few years back, and especially by a group called School Mental Health Ontario, and they're part of the Ontario Ministry of Education in Canada. So their ministry has supported school mental health implementation for years now. They recognized back in 2015 when they started having Syrian refugees, they recognized that for more support for newcomers within their schools. So they provided funding for a number of things happening within newcomer communities and schools, and specifically for the development and the implementation of Strong, which is something I hope we can have. Like they have, it's really very impressive, the funding that they had to support such an initiative. I do also want to acknowledge across the border, Chicago, like the new newcomer communities. Actually, we've done, if we have time at the discussion, I would like to talk about how we were preparing the environment for creating welcoming spaces in general, not only in schools. So what happened, it was really beautiful collaboration between Canada and the team from Chicago, since the team in Chicago have like working with the refugee mental health agencies. So I'm just quickly gonna talk about this. Yeah, here. Yeah, and actually just one thing I want to mention, when as I said, I'm honored to be on the development team of this curriculum, and when they asked me, what do you think? So that we were looking at the cultural sensitivity, and I really felt like, wow, I wish I I had any skills when I was young. Actually, all what I know about feelings or problem solving, I have it as my preparation to be a clinician. So I was like, whatever you give, unfortunately, given that I know what the background or educational system in Syria, you know, those skills will be very helpful for the students, regardless to their traumatic experience that they went through. So I'm just gonna talk quickly about the, you know, how this manual was developed, and also like the evaluation data that we have, and also I will share, if time, like a short video about what the clinicians in Canada had to say about their experience and how strong was for them. So why school? When we think about you know, why we thought about implementing this in schools, as we know, people have stigma and many barriers for seeking support and seeking mental health services. So that's why, you know, like it's really, it's hard to see them going to the traditional mental health support settings. So we're thinking of a way that we bring, as I said, it's like working on bringing awareness to the community members, community agencies, and at the same time having clinicians from those agencies work in schools, so we can, so they can both enrich each other. As we know, schools have long been recognized as a place where we can support newcomer youth, and just by bringing interventions into schools, we can work toward reducing stigma. And this is actually, this is a report that came out many years back from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. In one of their task forces focused on refugee mental health, and they recognize that by bringing mental health interventions into schools, we can work toward really changing the ecology of the school and having the educators and their administrators in school building, thinking about how they can create broader, like, or environment that they're. We also, we know that schools are, we know that schools are really a critical place for early identification and intervention for mental health concerns across the board, but maybe more specifically for some of our marginalized communities who may not, again, making it through our traditional pathways of care to mental health support. Dr. Mina Fazil, who is based in England and is also a co-developer of strong conducted an analysis of some of the literature that did exist on mental health for youth, and identified through this analysis, not surprisingly, that schools serve as a critical place for early identification and intervention for newcomer youth, and also the initiation rates of mental health services and the follow-through rates are higher when conducted in other natural settings in the community than when conducted in traditional community mental health settings. So a bit of background. One second, something got stuck. Okay, so as I said, it started in Canada. As we know, it's not a secret that Canada did a very, like, a better job than the US, unfortunately, welcoming refugees and kind of like being really prepared to serve them. So this is, they had already monitoring functions, and they had like round tables, so they can all like come together and think about how can we support the refugees and what can we do. And also they provided they provided a lot of resources and videos to equip the many communities in general and the schools, so they have like more welcoming environments. And there's, if you go to School Mental Health Ontario, if you're interested in learning about the resources that they were provided, as I said, like videos or you know, any data or information, you can find it there. So they started what they, I mean, started to see that educators and school mental health or clinicians in schools were really struggling by the idea of answering questions or reaching out to those newcomers. Kind of like they were hesitant of like, shall we ask them about their story, shall we not? So they felt really that it needed kind of like more of like knowledge or psychoeducation about the experiences of newcomers. So, and also we were, let me just see here, when it's not clicking for some reason. Okay, so here's the collaborators, all of them. We have the center, the team at the Center for Childhood Resilience in Chicago that I'm also honored to be part of. They had a lot of experience with Tier 2, Tier 3 interventions. I don't know if you're familiar. So it's interventions that it's been implemented in schools. So we kind of like, as you say, like as you see, we have all of those partners come together. One is focused on the research, like Western University, and in addition to, like, as I said, like Chicago and Ontario and the National Center for School Mental Health. Okay, so the intervention itself was based on a number of empirical studies and the work that did exist in the field, both from the school-based interventions literature and also refugee immigrant mental health literature, the resilience literature, positive development literature, and it was also very specifically designed as school-based intervention to fill with this multi-tiered system of support. Yeah, here. We talked a lot during the development of where does this fit, where does a strong fit. The group developed this acronym of welcome for newcomer, with the idea that we can't only implement an intervention in schools without equipping schools to think about how they can create more welcoming environment to support the well-being of their students, especially the ones who are at a greater risk of post-traumatic stress symptoms, and also to identify students with functioning concerns. Okay. So this is kind of examples. I'm going to be able to, so quickly I'm going to skim through them. Again, like how can you make a place or a school welcoming? We did a lot of that also in Chicago, as I mentioned, which is sometimes having signs in the classrooms and in the students' languages, sometimes just kind of like being educators to greet the students or encourage greeting the students with a smile and saying their name, which is something that might kind of sound normal or something that's happening, but it doesn't always happen. Again, usually many clinicians or even like staff in school, they were like, because we have the language barrier, we're not sure how to address the students. So it's really normalizing all of those concerns was really essential as part of this work. The team in Chicago actually did like focus group for like Syrian refugees, and where we asked them like, how would you like us to support you? And they said, we would like to learn about how to use a locker, and you know, like how, and we kind of like don't think about those smaller things, but you know, being in middle school and high school, we will see even our children who were born here, they might kind of have the same concern. Also, of course, they asked about more deeper things like how can we avoid and shut down racist jokes, how can we, you help us when we're in trouble, and how can we understand, I mean, that this school is going to be different than the school overseas. So again, as I said, strong fits with the multi-tiered system of support. The lines are not very clear. We try to make it really kind of broad when we select our students, because it is more of a strength base. So basically, because we have a lot of discussions like from different cities, like, and like, how can we, what is the selection criteria? And we always say, like, you know, we're trying to support whoever is struggling with transition, regardless to the level of trauma that they went through. So as I mentioned earlier, it's the structure of STRONG. We really borrowed heavily from CBITS and Bounce Back, which are school-based interventions for treatment of trauma, and they've been implemented. Now, again, like CBETS is like it has a structure that is feasibly like implemented in schools, and you know, you might ask, why didn't we then just use CBETS or bounce back, which is the same kind of adapted version, but it's for younger children from kindergarten till grade 5. And the answer is because it was CBETS and bounce back focus more on trauma and adversity, while we wanted something to be more strength-based. And that's the exciting news or the difference that Strong really brings, is the idea that we want to give them skills and we want to focus on what really helped them to go through their journey versus only focusing on the deficits and the trauma that they went through. And of course, like even when we ask the students, they would say, if you read here, they say, I don't speak English, but I speak 6 other languages. People think I'm afraid. People pity us. So that's why we really try to focus on the strengths that people have. Okay, so when we think here, like quickly about Strong, it's a manual. It's very, I'll show it to you in a second. Like very, very easily used. It's everything is very well described. You see here the content areas. We emphasize strengths and outside support, and then we talk about stress. What does it look like, and how do we experience stress during like in transition. We also talk about the pre-migration, migration, and post-migration stress and their experience with that, and we allow students to share their experiences. We also talk about measuring and managing feelings and the use of helpful thoughts. And you can also see like core cognitive behavioral features woven throughout. We do also steps to success. And we have them think about goal settings and problem solving, and then the group all like we have them share their journey narrative, and which is, for some of you who are experienced in trauma narrative, this is different, because again, we're not focusing only on trauma. We ask them to choose whatever they want, part of their story to talk about and to share it with the group. So here again, we're empowering them. Yes, you see, like here's the manual. We have worksheets. We have breathing exercises throughout, and we also have engagement and functioning. This is for the teacher to keep track. We also have worksheet that we send to the parents also, so they can be part of this process. And as I said here, we focus in the journey narrative on strengths as well. And in the very last session, we do graduation, and it's always nice to see them, you know, gaining those skills and feeling very happy. Actually, like what we noticed is that, you know, those students began to have community within those groups, and every time they'll bring new students and they say, can we have more of our classmates or people that we know in the group? And of course we can't really do that, but that shows how much they're happy about it. And so we've been doing the research part also. I think my time is I would, yeah, we can, maybe if we have any questions, we can talk about them more with the, with the Q&A.
And you can always share these resources.
Yeah,
and
sure.
We put it with the presentation. I know it's such an in-depth topic that we can continue to talk about it. And I'm so glad you're working via schools, and because the bullying numbers that are coming out, that tells us that Muslim kids are being bullied twice the rate of national bullying rate. That is, we need to focus on schools anyhow, and especially with this vulnerable population. So thank you. Just a reminder to our participants that you can ask questions in the chat box or can individually send questions to the panelist. And I don't see, can we go to the screen, main screen, full screen?
Yeah, Hadia, can you stop sharing your
Okay.
screen, please? Yes. You'll have to hit that stop share. Wonderful. Thank you.
Because I can't see all the panelists. So before we get any questions, I don't see any questions, and I don't know if each one of you got any questions. I don't see any in the chat box. So I do want to go back to Yassmin and Leila. You talked about, I still can't see the panelists.
And Dr. Abbasi, you will have to click on the grid view.
Okay, okay. So I was thinking that if you use the word trauma-informed care a few times in your presentations, and we also know that there is so much research around adverse childhood experiences, and given the fact that 52% of the refugees are children, I was just wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that when you say trauma-informed care, what does it mean?
Yeah, of course. I think that that's incredibly important. And part of why I was saying that I'm sure we can do like its own full presentation around that too, just because it's not just a matter of course, the traumatic events that children in the family may have experienced, though that is incredibly important. And thus providing like meaning and explanation and understanding of those events is incredibly important, but also for individual or adults like parents or guardians in the family too, to be able to make sense of their own trauma and also help their kids make sense of their trauma too. So when I'm thinking, or when we're thinking about trauma-informed care, it's really about being mindful that it's going to take time to be able to build trust in the relationship, to be able to then talk about the traumatic experiences and stuff too. And I think that oftentimes when we're thinking about services, it's a matter of maybe just the practical or just the trauma. And also with the trauma, we, you know, especially in depending on where the work may be done, it might be on the shorter end, it might be limited sessions, but trauma-informed care often takes time and takes patience with it as well too. And so really being informed and thinking in that perspective in terms of this is going to be long work, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't need to happen. And so maybe if you have limited time, you're just going to think about coping skills and you're going to focus more on that aspect because you know that's the limited time that you have. But also at the same time trying to advocate for, no, we need to spend more time with this. The family needs to build trust within each other, within the clinician, to be able to get to a place where they can explore some of these increasingly difficult experiences they may have had as well too. And I'm not sure.
I think also, we see with trauma, it not only affects your cognition, your physical and mental health, but the behaviors change, right? And I think one piece that when I was learning about trauma-informed care, the important piece was that we focus so much on the behavior, like a child acting out, or mother screaming and yelling at. So I love the narrative that instead of talking in terms of what is wrong with you, thinking in terms of what wrong happened to you. Mm-hmm. And it's very hard for especially school teachers or social workers or people who work in refugee settlement. So it's so important that we kind of advocate more for trauma-informed care. So no, I was really, that thing really stuck with me. Another thing, going back to you, Diana, how are you navigating? So I know with the COVID-19 currently, a lot of resettlement travel is suspended. And also when the research and search for refugees who are putting themselves in danger to get to the other countries. Also, I found out that the program in Freiburg was shut down. So I know there was a lot of political lashback against the refugee resettlement in Germany. And Merkel, almost the German chancellor, she was up for re-election and was having trouble with that. So please, if you can talk to us more about how sad it is that the politics of the country affects this process so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for your question, Dr. Farah. I think when I was in Berlin myself, you couldn't separate the political situation from the personal situation of refugees who are attempting to integrate in this context. And this is even, I mean, I was there in 2018, so this is 3 years after the peak of the refugee crisis. And at this point, people have learned the language, they've integrated into the labor market, and they're setting up their lives there, and their kids are enrolled in schools. But unfortunately, even in a city as diverse as Berlin, you could still see some of the tensions in the society, and the way that people were coping with this was creating, some kind of their own communities. And I showed you that picture from Arab Street. I mean, the majority of refugees are now they're living in areas throughout the cities and rural parts of Germany where they're kind of living in close quarters with other refugee communities and Muslim communities. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does inhibit integration. It does inhibit interactions with the host country society. And in a place as different as Germany, I think from what I saw from my own family members, it's necessary, especially in these very early years, to interact with members of the host community, to be able to exchange stories and experiences for people to start to understand a bit more where these refugees are coming from and the circumstances that brought them there. Because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, and the discrimination comes just from a lack of knowing. And this is why, I mean, I wish we could address this issue on a broader scale, but starting in mental health clinics, starting in hospitals where refugees are seeking essential care, we can start with some of the mental health providers that are interacting with these populations, who are providing advice on how to cope and how to integrate into society. And we need people who are bridges, people like us who understand both contexts, where both the Western context and some of the contexts in which these refugee populations are coming from, in order to develop interventions and policies that will facilitate integration.
So maybe this is a question for all three of you. So we are facing a vulnerable population. The trauma is there, the political opinion is turning against them in most of the countries. On that, COVID-19 is happening. And so what is your experiences? And all four of you can take turns and maybe talk about it, how COVID-19 is specifically affecting these populations that you are working with. And we can, you can start, Diana, and then we can go to Hadia and go back to Yassmin and Leila.
Absolutely. So, I mean, COVID-19 has resulted in a lot of discriminatory language against refugees and immigrants, not only in contexts like Germany, but around the world. And I mean, like you mentioned, Dr. Farha, we saw the closure of borders earlier this year, to which Germany, I think, resisted until the last second and still let in unaccompanied minors into their borders. But we've closed borders effectively here in the US, and it's an issue that's going to be persistent for years to come. And this will also inhibit individuals being able to access mental health or other types of healthcare, being able to go to clinics and not feel fear of contracting the disease or of being scapegoated as people who are spreading the disease and bringing it from other countries. So, I mean, already we've seen a drop-off in numbers of people migrating or being able to arrive into new countries, especially in Germany. And there's been a drop in asylum-seeking applications this year due to this crisis and other reasons. But what I think is, in terms of how it's impacted individuals, I think it's caused a lot of fear. And on the subject of culturally sensitive messaging, it's really important that we expand our messaging to people who are Arabic speaking or from other countries in order to provide culturally sensitive public health messaging as well, so that they understand the risks of the disease as well.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the work you guys are doing. So Hadia, would you add to that? In our own country, we are preparing for an election, and COVID is being considered a foreign problem or being brought in by these refugees or immigrants. So how is it impacting your work?
Yeah, well, I mean, as was mentioned in all the other presentations, that advocacy is a huge part of, like, sometimes even even individually talking about it. I try to be optimistic, really, because we've been in this, like with the Syrian revolution, it's almost 10 years. So I believe that people are resilient, and I believe that you will find your group once you're, I mean, you know, like when you look for them. So I feel like I'm really blessed to have like a team in Chicago who is really, we have task force, whoever want to reach out afterwards and to join. And that's the purpose when we're here at this conference, also knowing who is interested in this work, so we can, because we can't do this work alone, as you said. Like it's really, it's going to take longer time, and also going back to strong, the idea is giving skills, even if the person is traumatized. And I've worked with a lot of like youth who faced like horrible experiences. But again, I noticed sometimes just some skills that just for someone, they said for schools to have a specific group for them. So it's like 10 session group. They show them that we want to understand you, we want to give you this safe environment that could go on and help them for years. And again, I'm not underestimating or belittling the experiences, but sometimes when we think about trauma and we think like, oh my God, like, you know, how it affects the brain, it makes us helpless sometimes. But also we know that there's something called post-traumatic growth, in which, you know, when we focus on providing support, then actually the individuals can, as it says like in the definition, they will bounce forward, meaning what they went through, they will utilize this as a strength.
Absolutely.
Help look at it differently. So that's what I believe. I keep hopeful. And
I like that. There we get very pessimistic. So we need some positive silver lining, always looking for that silver lining. And acknowledging your comment, we definitely agree that we are grateful that Germany did take the major number of refugees, almost. Yes, there is so much more that we need to do in the US. And of course, the recent decision not to fund UN anymore, of course, that's all those are going to be, again, we talked about advocacy. So we do acknowledge Germany's generosity on one hand, but I think when you're working with the refugee population, one thing that really stands out is none of the countries are looking at it as a long-term issue. Everywhere where I have visited refugee camps, it's like a temporary solution, a band-aid solution. Like a family is uprooted and brought in, and they assume that now you are in a peaceful environment, that you are being provided for, that you should be grateful, you should be thankful, but there is no long-term integration process in any country so far. So that is something that really breaks my heart, and that's why we are having these discussions, not to say one country is doing better than the other. I hope there are more successful models that come out which focus on this problem in a long-term manner and not just a short solutions. So going back to, but thank you for your comment. We definitely acknowledge that. And so going forward, Yassmin and Leila, if you can add to how COVID-19 has affected your work or is affecting the population that you're working with?
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. I'm sure both of us will have things since we're working as clinicians and interacting. One thing that I've noticed that has been difficult is just transitioning to telehealth work. So in the online sphere, it's, you know, when the pandemic started, especially with family work, it's not necessarily safe yet or won't be safe soon to be meeting in larger groups. And so a lot of our work is being done through telehealth, which means that for particular individuals who may not have access or the ability to be able to set that up, it can sometimes be difficult. So with a lot of families, it's just even the logistics of getting them to Zoom or however it may be to be able to provide that therapeutic relationship or cultivate that relationship, yet like through a screen. I think there are a lot of challenges as clinicians of just feeling like maybe work happening right now is just kind of maintenance work and feeling like some of that deeper work is being put on hold for a bit. I think as time goes by, clinicians are getting better. I know myself, I'm adapting better to the telehealth format of counseling, but at the same time, it's a challenge. And so the other thing that I notice is like for family work is organizing everyone in the home to come together, to sit on a table, to be in the counseling room or whatever that may be in telehealth is a lot as too. There's a lot going on for families. There's a lot, they're in their comfortable space too, which can be really beneficial, but at the same time, sometimes can be challenging too. So that's definitely one thing with the COVID situation that I've noticed that have been a challenge for families.
So we have a couple of minutes left, and I would like all of you to give us a final ending message. How I look at the field of refugee care is growing need and shrinking resources. And you all, I'm so great that we can provide you this platform that you guys can connect to each other and collaborate with each other and know that you have the whole tribe behind you. But just I would like to hear an ending message from all of you before we end the session, because I don't see any comments or questions coming from our participants.
And while you're making your lasting comments, I will play our sponsor's ad and spotlight you as you come along. So please announce your name and tell me that you're going to be making your ending comments, and I will continue.
Talking about resources, we need to cultivate ours. Go ahead, Dinah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Farha. It's such a privilege to be on this panel, and I'd just like to close with something optimistic, hopefully, despite all of the circumstances we're facing in our current work. When I first joined the Muslim Mental Health Conference in 2015, I was a psychology undergraduate student, and I was sharing a poster on stigma, which is the topic that initially got me interested in considering Muslim mental health broadly, and then I became more interested in refugee mental health and how these things play out in humanitarian settings. And something I've noticed in the last few years regarding stigma is that, especially for individuals who have fled conflicts in masses, so people like, for example, the Syrian refugees who have left all at once, there's just been a massive amount of people displaced and now reintegrating and resettling in new contexts, that people are acknowledging now that what they witnessed in their lifetime and what they endured is not normal, and that it's completely okay to ask for help, and that although there might be some barriers from asking family for help or seeking mental health services within that context, that they're going to mental health service clinics, they're walking through those doors, they're asking for mental health care. And those are things that I thought were unprecedented and I didn't see in my community growing up here in the United States. So there is this kind of collective feeling that people are overcoming some of these stigmatic barriers that previously existed. They're acknowledging that it's not just them, but it's many others who have experienced trauma, and they're seeking health care for themselves and also for the sake of their families. So that's something that's hopefully an empowering note that I could leave you with, and really such a privilege to be here. And thank you everybody for attending and listening.
Yeah,
Thank you, Diana. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say, although like I'm, most of my work, I'm a clinician, but I've learned throughout the years that really maybe what's more important than the one-on-one session is the idea of the holistic approach and how we can bring all like people on board, whether they're in schools or agencies, and sometimes, as I mentioned, maybe small steps that we can do can help a lot, even if the person is struggling with traumatic symptoms. So that's something much that yes, you can do something wherever you are. It's just the idea, I would just say, stigma of this perception of refugees and what can I do. So when we think about a problem as like a huge problem, like, oh my God, millions of people, or like trauma is a scary word. When I say I'm a trauma specialist, even for like sometimes to other therapists, they'll be like, oh, that's heavy. So imagine people who don't know about our field. And so I don't use that anymore. Like I really kind of hide this kind of piece of information because it's for those school-based clinicians in schools. they kind of like all told me like, yeah, I'm not sure, I don't know that this is a refugee, I don't know what to deal with them, and they're with them every day. So imagine what the child will feel. So it's again normalizing that these are people, you know, just be a care skills, but your role is instrumental in the adjustment of this human being. I mean, in Chicago, we've been, I'm just going to end with this, like in Chicago, when we implemented the strong, unfortunately, only 5 sessions out of 10 because of COVID, but even the parents were telling me, because I told they need to be like kind of involved in the process, that we have a session for them. They said, I wish you do this for us. Like, you're asking me about my kid's feelings and how I'm helping him manage when he's struggling, and I need some help struggling my own emotions. So it's really, some skills can go really like, you know, like can be very supportive.
Hadia, there is a lot of interest. People want to know if you can share Strong's website and how can they access Strong program. What age range does Strong aim to help, and can it be used for only Arabic speaking individuals?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, yeah, sorry to interrupt, Dr. Abbasi. Yeah, 12, now it's translated into 12 languages. We applied it in Chicago in Urdu, Spanish, and of course English. It's in 12 languages. You can go to National Center for School Mental Health and you will find Strong. And also, if you just Googled, you will find it. We have 2 manuals, one for elementary and one for secondary. So it really covers most of the grade levels. I'll be very happy, and that's really was my goal, to kind of bring it to everybody, like here nationally and internationally, because I really believe, again, I was a trainer, I implemented it, and I'm on the research team. I really believe in it. I feel like I'm doing like a commercial now. Strong, we want to support.
So can you share the website in the chat box, please?
Yes, I will.
Okay, so why don't I give Leila and Yassmin the last minute to finish their ending comments, and then we can.
Yeah, so I really wanted to highlight also, like in the midst of everything that's going on socially and politically right now, the importance of social justice advocacy, especially with this population, and helping them get resources, working toward, I guess, in the institutional, personal, and social level, how brainstorming and figuring out ways that we can advocate as clinicians for this population. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Yes.
and I would just add to that. First of all, thank you so much for having us, and definitely really appreciated this conversation. I think it's really important. I would also add to that in terms of just being mindful about like our ability to collaborate. So something you said, Dr. Abbasi, was that we have limited resources. So now more important than ever to make sure that we're tapping into the ones that do exist and working together with the resources that already exist, making sure that we're helping. And I think that we have a role where we can try to help and make sure we are able to tap into all of these, so that, you know, this population has the most, they can get the most out of what already is out there. I think that's going to be incredibly important and useful moving forward. And one thing that really just stuck out to me about our conversation today was just taking the strengths-based perspective. So really just focusing on, this is an incredibly resilient group of people who've been through a lot, and really trying to highlight strengths rather than focusing on deficits, I think is going to be incredibly important as well too.
Thank you all. Thank you for all the amazing work you guys are doing. More strength, more power to you. And as you know, we all are here in any way we can support and augment your work. But just to end on a positive note, I don't know how many of you know of the story that a man goes to a beach and sees a lot of these fishes. Our wave has brought a lot of fishes and they're all over the sand. And he starts picking one and putting it back. And somebody comes in and said, how can you make a difference? And he picks another one and said, I made a difference for this one. So I guess that's all we can focus on, is taking one small step, one individual, one family, and hopefully that can have a ripple effect. But again, thank you for all of you. And please take care of yourself. And thank you again for being a part of our 12th Muslim Mental Health Conference. Take care.
We're honored. Thank you so much, Dr. Abbasi.
Thank you, everyone.
And I'll see you shortly for keynote.
Yes, for everyone who's attending, our keynote starts in about 13 minutes. So that's the time you have to go get your lunches. We'll see you there.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.